quite excited about hearing from John and Layla, who are definitely at the forefront of expertise in developments to prevent, what has been recently been happening, because there have been various announcements, various changes to legislation that we all need to know about. So we'll look forward to hearing from them. I think first of all, I'm just going to give a brief overview of Prevent and what it is and what it looks like, and the experiences of Prevent, and then I'll hand over to them. So could we go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, so here we go. Yeah. So just a brief introduction from me to Prevent in education. And you'll all be familiar with this CCTV shot of the three girls, including Shamima Begum, that left from Bethnal Green Academy to travel to northern Syria quite a few years ago. Incidentally helped by a Canadian spy to get there. This is obviously one of the worst case scenarios for the harms of Prevent. And that might seem slightly contradictory, because it isn't Prevent meant to stop this kind of thing from happening. But what's notable about this is that I was teaching in the school next door to Bethnal Green Academy when this happened. And it's notable that working in that community, knowing some of the family members involved, that no adults in these children's lives knew anything about their frustrations with the British state, about their aspirations to travel, or any of their concerns. And I would put the reason for that firmly at the door of Prevent and the chilling effect that it affects in schools. And that is to say that when I was teaching, I used to have constant, robust, heated, and respectful political discussions and arguments particularly with the teenagers that I worked with. And that was fundamental to working as a teacher. It's fundamental to work as a teacher in a democracy, because children need to practice playing with diverse views, and schools should offer a safe space to practice airing different views, even radical views, because that's how we practice democracy. And it is, after all, the ability to express views that other people disagree with, which enables us to live in a peaceful society. That was totally undermined by Prevent, because it happened almost overnight at the time of the Trojan Horse hoax in Birmingham, which forced Prevent into schools, that the children in my care stopped overnight. They stopped having political conversations. And it was soon after that these girls travelled to Syria without the knowledge of any of the adults in their life. And I would firmly believe that had Prevent not been in place in the months running up to them travelling, that someone, a teacher or a parent, would have been alerted to their concerns and would have been able to intervene, and the tragedies that followed and that are ongoing would not have happened. So Prevent, to my mind, actively undermines safeguarding and makes children less safe, not to mention that it actively undermines democratic citizenship. I've actually just this morning, I'm a school governor for a primary school near here, and I've just had to do my governor's safeguarding training. It took me about 3 hours, and a significant portion of that was taken up by reading through and listening to videos of people describing the government definitions of radicalisation and extremism. It literally required for me to listen to definitions and type them down again, and do that repeatedly over the course of about 20 minutes for the Prevent part of that training. And I think it was Brent Watch, I think you've estimated that around 5 million people have been forced to do this training. But considering that I'm one of, I think, 7 or 8 governors in this school, I don't know if you included governors as well, but that might put that number even higher. But certainly we're talking about millions of people have done this training involving repeating the government's definitions of extremism and radicalisation, which in a process which I think you could really only categorise as grooming. It's being groomed into an anti-democratic mindset that doesn't accept views that differ from our own. And the great irony of this, and this is the point that I'll finish on, is that the government definition of extremism includes people who are opposed to democracy. So this strategy, which is supposed to safeguard people, is actively undermining safeguarding, making children less safe, and even on its own terms is failing by undermining democracy. That's my overview of the harms that Prevent is doing in education. So I'll now hand over to John and Layla. And if you want to save up any questions, maybe put them in the Q&A while they're talking, and we'll come back. And for the last half hour of this, we'll have a bit more of a conversation. So over to you.
Okay, what I'll do is introduce the new developments in Prevent that have come about as a consequence of the Shawcross review. The government is in the process of implementing all of the recommendations, and we can see some of that implementation taking place in documents that are new guidelines and so on that are already being published this month. Overall, the direction of Prevent is reduced local autonomy and greater political direction from the Home Office. This will take place through a newly defined role for the Commission for Countering Extremism, which is no longer an independent advisory body, but is in effect a political directorate within the Home Office, responsible for Prevent across government departments and throughout England. And it will also operate through new regional commissioners for Prevent, which supersede the former local organisation and particularly Prevent priority areas. There's a new political direction as well, and it's carried in this quote: the present boundaries around what is termed by Prevent as extremist Islamist ideology are drawn too narrowly, while the boundaries around the ideology of the extreme right wing are too broad. That's a contention of the Shawcross review, and it's in the light of that all the new documents, training documents and guidelines that are already in production are being developed. So you can expect new guidelines, new training in the light of this comment. And there is also enhanced monitoring of public bodies such as schools, colleges, etc. And that enhanced monitoring is going to be particularly important. And just to remind you, I mean, Layla will talk about this later, but in 21-22, 13% of Prevent referrals proceeded to a channel intervention. Of these, 42% were for far-right extremism, 19% for Islamist extremism, yet they made up a similar proportion of referrals. So the actual Prevent process suggests that right-wing extremism is more significant than Islamist extremism, and yet that is being shifted back. So one can expect greater emphasis upon Muslim communities and pupils and students from Muslim backgrounds. So the thing to recognize is that Prevent referrals are only the tip of an iceberg of the scrutiny of individuals. So the first step, where somebody is being considered under Prevent, doesn't enter into official Home Office data, but it does involve possible interview of a child or young person by counter-terrorism police. And Layla's going to speak later about those harms which were disregarded by the Shawcross review and by government. But this data on pre-referrals, if you like, is recorded by public bodies, monitored by agencies like Ofsted and the Office for Students for indications of compliance by public bodies. And just identify for you, paragraph 88 of the new guidance states, to ensure consistency and proportionate delivery, each authority should maintain appropriate records to show compliance with the Prevent duty. This should include keeping track of any Prevent training being undertaken by staff. Specified authorities should consider their record-keeping arrangements for Prevent referrals to ensure they are proportionate and appropriate. And so there's going to be a greater emphasis on record keeping as a basis for ensuring compliance. And the Commission for Countering Extremism will run a complaints process, but it's not designed to express concerns about any harms to children, but to report failures of implementation. Here's another quotation: where prevent activity has fallen short of the standards set out in this guidance, practitioners and the public may raise concerns through an independent complaints function. So the complaints function is designed for whistleblowing within institutions to ensure that compliance with Prevent is being maintained. Okay, next. So the next thing is to indicate that this is expanded monitoring of authority, public authorities, public bodies, but also expanded surveillance. And if we understand that Prevent is directed at ideas which, despite being judged extreme, are nonetheless lawful, the new guidelines extend the surveillance of pupils and the expression of their ideas. So what is set out are distinctions between low risk, at risk, medium risk, and high risk ideas and behaviours. The proposal is that a learner can move very quickly between the risk categories. You should deal with any escalation of risk immediately and record this in their file. So recording is being emphasised, but notice that this includes what's called low risk activities, which are now precursors to things which might be considered more serious. Obviously, low risk doesn't merit a Prevent referral, does merit an intervention to challenge those ideas. And I'll give you the examples they give of low risk. I've highlighted the particular ones in yellow: criticising government policies, taking a keen interest in national and international affairs, demonstrating support and supporting causes, showing interest in a political or new interest in a political ideology or religion, holding or expressing conservative values or practices, whether traditional, cultural, or religious. The purpose of the text in brackets is to indicate that there are violent versions of these, which must be an immediate referral, but this is for non-violent expressions, which represent the normal part of growing up and developing ideas. And the emphasis is on recording process, so it shows how far scrutiny and recording will extend. And at the same time, because there's under the Prevent duty, there is the possibility and requirement of sharing information with other agencies. So this is quite significant in terms of the way in which data protections are limited. Now, the interesting thing is that what I've set out so far is obviously very much directed at the Department for Education and particularly schools, further education colleges, sixth form colleges and the like. But there is a new regime being suggested for higher education. And what Shawcross set out was concern about compliance in higher education settings indicated by low numbers of referrals. So the scrutiny and monitoring and the role of the CCE will be to emphasize on universities that they are not currently fulfilling their duties under Prevent. Now, we can say one of the reasons for a low numbers of referrals is potentially associated with the age of students, adults in effect, and the voluntary nature of the Prevent process for those identified at risk. And so what I think we should expect within higher education setting is a redrafting of student contracts to ensure compliance, and also a redrafting of staff contracts, so that failures to engage with Prevent will potentially become indications of misconduct, student misconduct, and potentially staff misconduct. Now, of course, the monitoring of external speakers for extremism was the main area in which Prevent operated within universities. And this is now potentially in conflict with the new Higher Education Act, Freedom of Speech 2023, which requires university to give precedence to freedom of speech. But notice that the quote I gave at the start was that the other changes are directed at normalizing far-right speech. So, for example, Suella Braverman referred to Douglas Murray and his arguments around replacement theory as not being indications of extremism, but mainstream conservative or mainstream political values. And indeed, a leading counterterrorism expert, broadly and sympathetic with government aims, Raphael Pancello, had a Radio 4 program last night on replacement theory, arguing that replacement theory ought to be part of public discourse in order to reduce public anxiety and so on. So the paradox here, as Rob was suggesting, is that yes, it's a good idea that ideas should be discussed, but what Prevent is doing is saying what we need to do is have a more extensive discussion of right-wing ideas expressed in schools and expressed as aspects of government policy, at the same time as reinforcing the idea of normative Islam as extreme. And that's why we can expect a much greater impact of Prevent on Muslim pupils and students from school through to university. And this is going to be reinforced by the CCE within the Home Office providing a team of specialists to advise the sector and to counter critics of government on campus. And one of the things that you should note is that the so-called strand of Prevent, which is about disrupting extremists, also involves indicating that schools shouldn't use curriculum material that comes from groups identified as extreme. And of course, they've set the bar very low because low-risk activities are under the category of potentially extreme. Criticising government policy, criticising Prevent is now extremist. Over to you, Leila.
Thanks, John. Try and get to my slide. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time going through some of the already established consequences of Prevent in education and link these in via some of the case studies, and just conclude by linking it back to some of the implications that John touched upon. So as mentioned, over a third of the Prevent referrals, and this is according to the Home Office statistics, originate from the education sector. So each year there are over 2,000 young people who are being referred to Prevent, and that referral is originating from schools and colleges mainly. From Prevent Watch database, in terms of the 643 cases now that we've documented to date, more than half of our cases originate from schools. So most of the people who call us are parents who are concerned because their child has already been referred or is in the process of being referred to Prevent. And we've already documented these harms in the People's Review of Prevent. I'm going to just paste that into the chat as well, the link for that. If you haven't already seen it, you can have a read of it afterwards. And we've gone into great detail in terms of what types of harms we see, and we've tapped into that resource of the over 600 cases that we documented, as well as all of the literature that's come before this particular report to show the harms of Prevent, not only to children, but across society. So I'm not really going to go into those too much, but I am going to use a couple of case studies to illustrate my point. And that was published a year before Shawcross published his report. No heed has been taken, as mentioned by John, into some of the harms that we described with regards to the trauma that's being caused, with regards to the silencing of individuals that Rob mentioned earlier as well. So none of that's been taken into consideration at all in the Shawcross report. And then we go into, after Shawcross announced his recommendations, we actually go into all of the reasons why there is at least a very strong argument to remove Prevent from schools at the very least. And in fact, that argument stems from the evidence that was put forward by Shawcross, but he just didn't follow it through to its natural conclusion. And had he followed it through to its natural conclusion and had his independent review been an evidence-based review rather than an ideologically led review, then he too would have come to conclusion that Prevent shouldn't be in schools. So I've just also put into the chat the response to Shawcross as well. If you haven't seen that, we did do quite an extensive review of all the recommendations and why they're so flawed. So there's three spheres essentially of the education sector that we thought we were talking to when we were thinking about this webinar. So one in particular is young students and children in education. And that's usually where we're thinking when we're talking about education and preventing education. But the second part or second audience, I guess, are educators within the education sector, because it's also impacting them and how they perform their functions and do their job. As well as then the third audience, which is those who are in further education or higher education, because it applies slightly differently to them. And as John mentioned, we see slightly less Prevent referrals when it comes to universities, for example, where Prevent is acting less on an individual referral basis and more in the space of like shutting down events and speakers who are being invited to campus to speak. Just get to the next slide. So my first case example, let me just remove this, I'm not sure if you can see it, is one of a young child. So this exemplifies young students at school and how they can be impacted by Prevent. So this 12-year-old Muslim boy was referred by his school because another student had alleged that he'd made a homophobic comment. Now, the school dealt with this as they should have, I guess. They took the students to one side, heard each side of the story, and the boy told his side of the story, which was that actually didn't make the homophobic comment that was alleged, and explained what he had said. But he apologized in a way that potentially this other child could have taken offense to what he had said. But the school still went on and made a Prevent referral. And their justification as a school, because these are from the documents that the school then tried to explain their decision for making a Prevent referral, according to them, it was a justified Prevent referral because the child had also shown an interest in violence. And so there's this joining up of the dots, right? This profiling of this student, like he has an interest in violence, he was alleged to have made this homophobic comment, and now we feel that it falls into this category of them being at risk, and we should just make the Prevent referral and allow for the experts to figure out whether or not this is a genuine radicalization case. Now, to give some context to what that interest in violence was, the interest in violence actually alluded to a piece of creative writing that the children were asked to do. And what this 12-year-old had done was he took the book from school that was assigned by school to use for this piece of creative writing. And he didn't even do very much of creative writing, because what he did was he kind of plagiarized the book. He just lifted excerpts from that book and plugged it into this creative writing task that they were assigned to do. And the book itself was quite a violent book that the school had assigned to them. And yet somehow they had logged this as a concern that his writing was violent, and then connected it to this alleged homophobic comment. And now all of a sudden they have a profile, someone that they think might be at risk. And that's how they justify their Prevent referral. So you can see how when you're coming in with this very securitized lens that everyone and anyone could be a risk, that all of these dots and data points start to become significant, even though when you look at them individually, they're easily justified and can be dealt with on a school level, and maybe some questions raised to the school as to why they were assigning that book in the first place. Just get to my next slide. So they handed this over to the Prevent experts, because obviously that's what everyone's being told to do. And this is what the new guidance also re-emphasizes. It says, don't worry about the referral, just send them through and we'll deal with them, and we'll vet them to see what is genuine and what isn't. And that's what I think most educators are relying on, and other people who make prevent referrals saying, okay, even if we make a mistake, someone else is going to be there to pick that up, and rather be safe than sorry. The prevent officer questioned this boy alone for about half an hour. And the prevent officer's assessment was that this child's views and values are causing offence, and he does require channel intervention. So it is a justified prevent referral. He requires channel intervention in order to stop him from later committing hate crimes. So this is the logic. This is the belt that he's going down. This is a trajectory he's going down. And what that child's views are, and this video is actually available on our social media if you haven't seen it already. I'll share the link in the chat once I get off during the Q&A. But he's asking him about his views on homosexuality. And the child says to him, I don't like it because it goes against my religion. And based off of this conversation where the boy keeps repeating this, and he says, I just don't like it because it goes against my religion, he keeps questioning him. And the prevent officer's main concern isn't anything to do with any violence. It's to do with this allegation that was already established, that it was a he said, she said type situation at school, already been dealt with internally at school. And the prevent officer keeps coming back to it and says, it worries me that you say you don't like homosexuality. Yeah? In the same breath, he also talks about being tolerant, about people's right to believe or do what they want. And yet this prevent officer can't get over that fact that this boy doesn't like homosexuality and it goes against his religion. And that's why he's saying, I can't like it. Another thing that the prevent officer mentions is that the parents' views are influencing this child's views. Of course they are. Every parent's views influences their child's views. Now, he doesn't mention anything about the parents being extremists, but just makes that reference to, this child is at conflict because he has his views and values, his parents have their views and values, and they're being influenced, and he doesn't really understand how to go out into the real world without causing offence to other people, which hasn't been the case until this particular prevent referral had been made. But you can see how there's always like a justification, even from the so-called experts, as to why this child should end up getting the channel support. And you can see from the justification of refocusing on Muslims and Islam, how these types of referrals, like this one, will continue to come through, and even more of these referrals will come through because they are very conservative Islamic views, and reshifting that focus back on Muslims will cause for more of these types of situations to occur. So the second focus is just on educators and regulators, and John touched on this in terms of Ofsted and other types of powers that could be used when it comes to compliance, being compliant with prevent. And this is a particular problem with schools, and we've already seen this. These aren't specific Prevent Watch cases, by the way. These are just cases that have come up in the media, and you may or may not be familiar with them. Again, I'll share the links in the chat in a second. But Ofsted downgrading nurseries, right, because they are failing to guard against radicalization. Another under one nursery in Canterbury, needs a better understanding of radicalization. These are under ones. Yeah. Then you have college in Croydon, who was marked as inadequate, and that inadequate rating also had a comment about the fact that during these tutor time, where people were in sixth form and they were supposed to be having the kind of almost like a PSHE type lessons with their tutors during tutor time, they were instead allowing their students to catch up with coursework, instead of having the knowledge and skills needed to make safe and informed decisions on relationships, and to understand the dangers of extremism and radicalization, and to lead a safe and healthy life. And so this was one of the reasons why it was downgraded as inadequate by Ofsted. So Ofsted has been tried and tested and used as a way to downgrade, but there are other powers as well that have been mentioned as part of the new guidance that can be used if people are being seen, schools and colleges, and as well as the universities are being seen as kind of failing or not complying with their prevent duty. And you can see how loose that term compliance can be as well, in terms of some of the definitions. This one's quite an interesting one as well, because we did have a case from a sixth form that came in just over a year ago, I think 2 years ago, sorry now. And it's linked to this further education and older students in further education. And it was run by 5 Pillars at the time. And it was about a 17-year-old at Joseph Chamberlain Sixth Form College who had gone in as part of their like tutor time and was made to do some kind of survey or quiz. He thought it was like a quiz. And what it was actually prevent training. And so the schools had gone even further than just doing their due diligence and they're having their due regard, which is what prevent is supposed to be. And that due regard is supposed to be for the educators themselves, for the staff, and actually displacing some of that onto especially the older children. So you can see how a 17-year-old is now expected to also be able to spot the signs of radicalization. And it might seem like a one-off in one college, but actually this type of normalization is quite dangerous. And I even went to a school, primary school, where I had to ask them, you know, why are you doing workshops to teach parents how to spot signs of radicalization? This isn't part of your prevent duty. And their justification was, yeah, you know, we want to go above and beyond our prevent duty. We want to be able to show that we're doing more. And so normalizing that then you can see is going to be a problem and they all kind of impact each other. We did have another case around about the same time where the head of the Islamic Society was asked to do prevent training, specifically just the head of the Islamic Society. And they justified this by saying, you know, it's because of your position, because you're head of the society, and so you get to meet a lot of people, and it would just be really good if you could be in a position where you can spot the signs of radicalization. They didn't ask any of the other society heads to do the training. It was only the head of the Islamic Society who was asked to do the training. And so again, you can see that with the new training, with the refocus on Islamist extremism, this will be more common. And then with that further pressure on educators and establishments to have, you know, better due regard or better compliance with prevent, you can see how more of these types of things may be pushed and then impact, especially the older students, with regards to doing these types of things in prevent training. So just a quick summary. So for young Muslim students, there's going to be many more misinformed referrals. That's what we're anticipating. They'll be justified because of the fact that there is this refocus on Islamist extremism, even though they are, you know, ultimately very biased and discriminatory moves by whoever is making this referral. And it will occur across all levels of the process, all the way through to channel. It will occur from the person who's referring them, if that's the teacher or the staff member, but it will also occur on the level of the prevent officer because of this renewed training. I believe this renewed training is already underway. I know that some of the recommendations have already been implemented, but there's about 2/3 that should be implemented by the end of the year. And for educators, the fear of being downgraded and the actions against that failure are going to go, means that they're going to go above and beyond, as I mentioned, what their due diligence or their due regard is going to be. And this is going to be enforced by the new mechanisms of complaints. So it's not just Ofsted anymore, but there's going to be a whole number of different powers that can be used to implement these. And some of these are already established. For older students, there's going to be a direct conflict with academic freedom, as John mentioned, but there will be further event disruptions in the name of permissive environments and extremist speakers. Permissive environments was a term that was introduced as part of the new duty guidance, which is, you know, people who don't quite fit the bill to be termed extremist speakers, but they're creating an environment where they're challenging or raising concerns about government policy, and therefore it's seen as a permissive environment. So you can see how this definition is going to be abused even more than the definition of extremism. But I'm done there.
Thanks very much, Layla, and thanks, John, as well. I'm slightly speechless at some of the things that you've brought up. It's sort of these are all a lot of things that we're all aware of, but I think it shows the value of having events like this for us to really kind of just hear them expressed fully. And just to sort of go over what John was saying, how, you know, it seems to be a direction of targeting more Muslims and less far right or fewer far right actors. And I think your point, John, which you made about the number of harms that occur pre-referral. And I know that that's been I mean, even going back from the days of David Anderson as the reviewer of counter-terrorism, I remember seeing him in heated arguments with people from the Home Office at their refusal to define exactly what a referral is. And I think it's important that we recognise that however a referral is defined, there are always going to be harms acting kind of upstream of that to far more people than we see it affected by the referrals. You reminded me when you were talking about the new low risk categories of criticising government policies, and essentially anyone getting involved in politics being classified as potentially extremist. And it reminds me of something that to go on a slight historical tangent here, but that a book that some people might be familiar with from 1975 was The Crisis of Democracy by the Trilateral Commission, in which European and American business leaders laid out their plans for essentially what a neoliberal economy now looks like. And the people that wrote that book went on to form the Carter administration, and gave us the sort of precariously employed citizenry that we now have. And effectively, in 1975, the crisis of democracy, as recognised by business leaders, was that people were getting involved in democracy. It was around civil rights and student protests, and strikes me that there is a direct parallel with that, and I think you can actually trace a heritage going back historically to that. That this is a continual effort to, no matter what it says, that in the past it was a crisis of democracy, or now counter-extremism is aimed at bolstering democracy. It is an active attack on democracy. Everything that you've described here are ways of undermining democratic citizenship. And then moving on to Layla, you talked about your case study. I just want to highlight to the participants that although you talked about one case study, I think it's really valuable to talk in depth about one case study, but that case study will have been replicated hundreds, if not thousands of times around the country. And I personally, as a teacher, have seen situations like that with my own eyes, which would indicate that it is kind of more, well, as prevalent as you suggest, and perhaps more prevalent. And just finally, just recognizing the kind of recent historical trajectory of Prevent. In 2015, when I was working in a school in East London, and we got a letter through from the local authority introducing us to the new Prevent coordinator and suggesting that we had to start implementing Prevent. I had a conversation with, well, in fact, not just with the head teacher in the school I was working at, but with a number of other head teachers in East London at the time, who all agreed that they'd known about Prevent since it had been implemented in 2007. So that was nearly a decade, and they'd actively ignored it because they recognised how harmful it would be. And I just go back to that point of reflecting on the Prevent training that I had to do this morning, that it is this process of grooming. It's a process of reading and describing back these categories that the government have defined of radicalisation and extremism. And that clearly, I mean, it clearly is effective in making people not only adopt Prevent in the way that they feel that they are duty bound to, but as you say, Layla, going above and beyond their requirements. And I think that's I think it's important to recognise that. So there is, we're in a pretty difficult place. I just want to end on, before I hand over to the questions on the floor, end up just on one positive note, is that I think there is, as professionals, and as John indicated, this is even going to be in higher education, brought into through contract changes, brought into professional standards to force people to adopt it. And certainly that's the case in schools and in hospitals, that people are duty bound to adopt Prevent. And so it is very difficult in a professional capacity to resist it. We can be more sensitive around referrals and encourage colleagues to be more sensitive. But I think on a positive note, just having these conversations, talking about it, is exactly what we need to be doing. So just thanking Prevent Watch for organising this. So I think I'll just go through some of these questions here. So Roshan had a couple of questions. I don't know, are the participants able to speak out, or are we just doing questions as text?
No, we can get them to speak out if
yeah,
if
Roshan, do you want to go? You were talking about what, you know, a practical advice maybe to John and Layla about how people could respond to that.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I mean, it's that's really it, really. Kind of, you've gone through the issues and the problems and given a great overview about how Prevent's going to be tightened across schools and higher education. But what practical advice can you give to students and parents on how to tackle this?
I think from a student and parent perspective, I mean, we get some parents, I think by virtue of them contacting us in the first place, we tend to get the more outspoken parents in the first place, the ones who are more willing to push back. I think it's important that they appreciate that, you know, even in the Prevent duty, they keep throwing back things like, oh, it's up to the school to understand how to incorporate this within their existing responsibilities and, you know, within the existing acts that they should adhere to. So I think we need to be more challenging of that. And I think parents need to stand up, you know, with their children in terms of whatever it is that they're facing at school. So if they are getting pushback because they've said something, rather than encouraging them to go silent and stop speaking or stop practicing their beliefs, or stop exercising whatever, you know, political views they have, that they should actually challenge and push back on the school, and maybe just ensure that more parents come together, particularly within secondary schools. I think usually in primary schools it's quite good because you tend to know the other parents, but in secondary schools, you know, children are a bit more independent, or, you know, you're not setting up play dates anymore. And so you tend not to be in like WhatsApp groups with the other parents in the schools. And so it's very difficult to come together and realize that there are certain trends or themes happening that you can all stick up and speak up about. And one of those things is these contracts that John referred to. You know, you go to school, you start a school, and you find yourself signing an agreement that you as a parent, your child as a student, are going to do your best to, you know, look out for signs of radicalization and fight extremism. It's like, since when did that become part of your agreement as a child and as a parent, as part of the code of conduct of your school? And that has become, and you'll see it snuck into I've already seen it myself, stuck into the contracts as students are starting school. And so, you know, just pushing back on, why do we have that? Why are we agreeing to this? You know, because what it can then mean is that the school without Prevent can end up excluding your child and say, well, you know, you didn't adhere to what our policies are. John, do you have anything to add to that? Sorry.
Yes, I think it's important to recognise that Prevent operates in the space of lawful ideas and behaviour. And so participation by parents and pupils with Prevent is voluntary. So it's not something that has to be accepted straightforwardly. It's hard to push back against it as an individual. And one of the things I found, particularly in the context of the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, was that people didn't like to speak about things because they felt ashamed of the finger being pointed at them. I think as long as we recognise there's no reason to be ashamed about either having particular kinds of political views, being interested in political questions, whether domestic or international, and no shame in normative Islamic values. And so I think that what needs to happen, as Layla was suggesting, is recognition that of one's rights, but also willingness to speak to others and make this more public and provide mutual support in a sense. I think that too many times, you know, that people are pushed back because they believe, well, there must be something to it. There was nothing to the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair. A school that was incredibly successful was undermined on the basis of false allegations. And so I think it's important to recognize that, and that when people are talking about extremism, they're talking about fairly mainstream ideas. And it's precisely because the government has adopted right-wing ideas that it's trying to argue that right-wing ideas are mainstream, but doesn't wish to allow that to other areas, opposition to government policy or Muslim communities.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think Roshan as well, just if I could just add to that, I think it is, and as both Layla and John have alluded to, it's I mean, the whole thing, the whole prevent duty is tied in knots, because, you know, if as John says, if you're meant to be not in, you know, if engaging in politics, actively engaging in politics, you know, I think we just think about, you know, what that means as parents. And there's one parent that I'm aware of whose children were affected by prevent referrals a few years ago, who has, you know, responded by just being incredibly politically active and politically active with the children, you know, turning up to political events and things like that. And I think we probably have to, certainly as parents, I think we have to think about how to encourage our children to be politically active. And I think in many ways that is the in a way that's the sort of panacea, is helping people to actually engage in real political action, and that being a way of sort of showing them that it is all right to speak out. And I think, you know, just on a practical level, I think that as Britain descends further and further towards the far right or into the far right, you know, that becomes more and more easy to do as there are greater attacks on civil liberties, failure of environmental policy, rivers full of sewage. You know, it's not difficult to be politically active in the UK at the moment, or to pick things to complain about. So hopefully that gives people a sort of an opening to be politically active. Roshan, I'm going to go straight into your next question, which do you want to ask it yourself about withdrawing?
Oh, just about the homeschooling. The vibe that I'm getting from a lot of Muslim parents is that if they are in a position to do homeschooling, they would, because they're fed up with prevent is one thing. I mean, I must admit the LGBT thing is another thing being kind of foisted upon them in schools. So obviously, I think most Muslim parents are not in the position to do this because it's so expensive in the West that you have to have two working parents. But those that can, I don't know what your views would be on that. And can I just ask a final question, because I have to go in about 5 minutes myself. I'm intending to actually write an article based on this webinar that you're hosting. Is that okay with you guys? This isn't a private thing, is it? Or
Yeah.
Fine by me.
Yeah? Okay. All right. So I'll just, by the way, you know, you're doing great work. I'm a donor to you guys, so I put my money where my mouth is. And please continue what you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Roshan.
Can I answer I'd like to answer that question, because I think that for me is one of the damaging responses, withdrawing children. I understand it. It happened after the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair. A significant proportion of parents withdrew into homeschooling. It has worse educational outcomes for children. So in effect, what it does is bring about damage to the achievements and opportunities for Muslim children. The schools in Birmingham were both strongly endorsed by the parents because of their Islamic ethos, and were delivering incredibly good outcomes. And Muslim children are tending to do well academically. So for me, one of the reasons for being so kind of upset about this process is that I do think that underlying it is a cynical disregard for the educational achievement of Muslim children and the fact that they are doing well in schools, and doing well in schools that provide an environment which is consistent with the values in their home as well. The interesting thing about the LGBT issue, because I was involved in that in Birmingham as well, is if you look at the Shawcross report, the one thing that is absent from the Shawcross report is the reference to opposition to LGBT teaching as extremists. And the reason for that is because it's been adopted as an issue within the Conservative Party by Miriam Gates and the new National Conservatives, or the New Conservatives. So there's a deep hypocrisy. I'm one of those people who thought that forms of the LGBT teaching were extremely positive, directed against bullying and harassment and so on. And by and large, those forms of teaching against discrimination and so on were strongly endorsed by Muslim parents, as in the case that Layla identified, with the child even saying, well, it's against my religious beliefs, but I believe strongly in the rights of others, and that they shouldn't be discriminated against. So I think we've got some serious discussions to happen here, but I would be really sad if Muslim children ended up getting a worse education than they could have if we ran our schools properly and we ran them without discriminatory policies.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks. Just because we've only got a few more minutes. Rose, you've written quite a lot. I'm afraid I haven't managed to read it all. But Rose, do you want to just could you be quite brief and a question rather than a comment?
A lot of the things I posted, just notes from that in case you hadn't seen it. It was just to as to whether you've had any thoughts on the government's proposals around sharing information for safeguarding, that that's come up.
Layla or John, have you got anything on that?
It's placed directly under safeguarding. So every excuse for sharing the data is always placed under safeguarding in the first place. Some of the data processing and data retention of this information is being challenged. I'm not sure in terms of the new guidance where we'll be going with this, because it does explicitly mention that, you know, even if people aren't going to agree to go onto channel, then they should still be monitored by the police. And so essentially what happens in the new duty guidance is it's explicitly said they still need to be monitored. And so the only way to continue monitoring them is to retain their data. So I think there's going to be issues there with regards to retaining that data, because if police are still retaining it, even if it's a misinformed referral, because that person's decided voluntarily not to go onto channel, then we could potentially challenge it, but I'm not sure how far we will get. I mean, we have mentioned some of these breaches of various rights when it came to the People's Review of Prevent, but we haven't mentioned any of the newer proposals with regards, because I know that some other things have happened with social care and safeguarding.
I'd like to add one thing to that, which is notice that when the Prevent duty was introduced in 2015, the government made a lot of its compliance with legal requirements and also cooperation with the UN. Since then, the UN rapporteurs have consistently criticised Prevent as being in breach of civil liberties and potentially the civil liberties of Muslim populations, and most recently have challenged the government's policy in relation to children's rights. But what has happened is, between Theresa May introducing the Prevent duty and now, the government has itself moved against human rights and civil liberties. So we actually have serious breaches of civil liberties, and a government which is increasingly disregarding those aspects. So I think it's a very, very serious moment.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to, because we have only got 1 minute left. Thanks, Jack, for typing your question out. I think that will save us some time. Jack has asked, can a student refuse to speak to a Prevent officer, or will they be arrested if they don't speak to the officer? I'll give you a brief response to that, and then maybe John or Layla would like to add a bit more. But you can refuse to speak to them. It is meant to be voluntary. However, it has been stated by people like Simon Cole, who was on the Prevent Review Board at the Home Office and is a former Chief of Police, that you potentially would become a subject of interest. You might be forced into a something like, to a de-radicalization program, and so the situation could escalate, although it is on paper it's a voluntary process. I don't know if that answers the question, or if John or Layla would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, usually people refuse to speak to them or ask them to put their concerns in writing. Once you ask them to put it in writing, they tend to go away. But you're right, Rob, sometimes it can be the case that if they can't speak to you via Prevent and they really are interested in speaking to you because they really think that you're interesting, then it could be the case that you're stopped in some other way or harassed.
RB revenues and benefits.
Sorry, someone needs
I think
to mute their mic. Well, John, did you have anything to quickly?
Yes, I think that's why we can expect it to be made part of student misconduct clauses, contracts at universities, that cooperating with officials in the course of their duties will be a requirement, or will open you to potentially misconduct cases. But you can refuse at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Vera. Thanks. I think we're gonna have to wrap up there because it's already 32 minutes past 1. And I just wanted to one final reflection on, which refers back to one of the earlier questions about taking children out of government schools. And I think I probably tend to agree with John that if you are critical of what's going in schools, then as parents, potentially members of parent committees, also perhaps members of governing bodies, you have the ability to engage in forming the direction of the school, which obviously, if you tap out of education, if you remove your children, then you're not going to be involved in that, and that's going to have a detrimental effect on the education of all of the children involved. So I would encourage people to stay involved, but I do fully understand the concern and the desire to get children out of those situations. But I'd just like to thank John, thank Layla, and thank MK and Prevent Watch more broadly for organising this event. And I think if this, just something to reflect on, I think just please try and keep talking about this as much as you can. If you see people who you think might be being affected by Prevent, see people who are often silenced further, make an effort to go and speak to them, make an effort to support them. Do everything you can to normalise speaking out against these things and supporting each other. So thanks very much, everyone. And and please keep in touch and sign up to the Prevent Watch newsletter as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Rob. And also
Thank
the
you, Rob.
Prevent Digest, guys, I've put in the link for the Prevent Digest. So Prevent newsletter, Prevent Digest to stay on top of everything Prevent related.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.